The basement archive of the Greenwood County Historical Society smelled like old paper and tired secrets. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, pale glow over rows of gray metal shelves and battered file boxes. James Mitchell checked his watch. 4:30 p.m., half an hour until closing. He rubbed his eyes under his glasses and leaned back from the wooden table, stretching his stiff shoulders. All day he'd been combing through land records from early 20th century Mississippi deeds. Transfers, tax rolls, page after page of neat ink and boring certainty. His client in Chicago wanted answers about a disputed inheritance. Some forgotten parcel of land in Greenwood. So far, all James had found were routine transactions and dead ends. He closed the ledger in front of him and exhaled. One more box, he murmured to himself. Then I quit. Along the back wall, a stack of unremarkable boxes slumped against each other. His eyes landed on a label written in fading black marker. Miscellaneous personal effects. 1980 to 1925. That was different. He hauled the box onto his table and lifted the lid. A faint, musty smell floated up tissue paper, mildew, and time. Inside, bundled in brittle wrapping, were old photographs. Some stuck together, some warped with damp, their edges crumbling. Carefully, James peeled them apart. Wedding photos, Sunday dresses, storefronts, church picnics. Most were clouded with water damage. Faces blurred, details lost. Then he saw it, near the bottom of the stack. Wrapped more carefully than the others was a single photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The image was remarkably clear, almost untouched by the years. In the corner, an embossed stamp read, Crawford Photography, Greenwood, Mississippi. March 1920. James held it closer. A formal family portrait. A black couple sat at the center, dressed in their finest. The man wore a pressed dark suit, his expression steady and proud, one hand resting on his knee, the other hidden behind the children. The woman sat straight back beside him, in a neat, dark dress, her hair carefully styled, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes met the camera with quiet resolve. Behind them stood 3 children. 2 girls, perhaps 8 and 10, wore white dresses with ribbons in their braided hair. Their faces were solemn, their bodies tense in the way children always seemed in old photographs, as if aware this moment would last longer than they would. Between them stood a boy of about 7, and that was when James froze. The boy's skin lighter, even in sepia, was unmistakably pale. His hair was light brown and wavy. His features were fine, his eyes clearly light-colored despite the aged tones of the photograph. The boy was white. The family around him was black. James' breath caught in his throat. He leaned in until his nose was almost touching the image, searching for some mistake, a trick of light, a printing error, anything. But the composition was natural. The man's hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. The girls stood close to him, not stiffly, not pulling away. The woman's gaze seemed to include him as surely as it did her daughter's. There was no awkwardness in the arrangement, whoever he was. This child belonged there. Heart beating faster. James turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and Thomas. March 14th, 1920. He read the names again. Samuel and Clara, Ruth and Dorothy. And the boy, Thomas. James, sat very still, the weight of the moment settling. Over him. In 1920 Mississippi, under Jim Crow laws, where a black man could be killed for the smallest perceived offense, a black family posing publicly with a white child wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Impossible. Dangerous. Potentially. Deadly. So why did this photograph exist? He dug his phone out of his pocket, snapped several pictures of the front and back of the portrait, then opened his notebook and carefully copied the names and date. His mind was racing now. No longer tired. This wasn't a routine document. This was evidence. He slid the photograph back into its tissue paper, handling it with reverence, then stood and carried it carefully to the front desk. The archivist, Mrs. Patterson, sat behind the counter, stamping due slips with the casual patience of someone who had spent a lifetime among paper and silence. She was small and elderly, with silver hair pinned back neatly and bifocals resting low on her nose. "Mrs. Patterson?" James said, trying to sound calm. "Do you know anything about this family?" He laid the photograph gently on the counter. She glanced down, lifting it with a practiced archivist's care. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes narrowed behind the lenses as she studied the image. Something in her expression shifted recognition or memory. James couldn't tell Dot after a long pause. She spoke. "That would be Samuel and Clara Johnson," she said softly. "Respected family. He was a carpenter. She took in sewing. And the children?" James asked. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. Her fingers lingered at the edge of the cardboard. "I've heard stories," she said finally. "Old stories. The kind people don't talk about anymore." She glanced up at the clock on the wall. "We're closing soon?" James swallowed his impatience. "Please, anything you can tell me." She looked at the photograph one more time, as if weighing something. "If you want to understand that photograph," she said, lowering her voice, "you need to talk to Evelyn Price. She's 93. Lives at Magnolia Gardens. Her mother knew the Johnsons." She slid the photograph back toward him. "Take it," James blinked. "Take it? Nobody's claimed it in 70 years?" she said. "Might be time someone figured out what it means." He stared at her, stunned. "Are you sure? You're the genealogist, aren't you?" Her eyes softened. Seems like it found the right person. Outside, the late afternoon light had turned warm and golden. James walked slowly to his rental car, the photograph tucked safely in a cardboard folder under his arm. He stopped beside the car and looked at the image again. 4 faces made sense. One did not. The impossibility of that small boy in the middle pressed against his thoughts like a thumb on a bruise. Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and Thomas, he murmured. "What were you doing?" Whatever happened in 1920, someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. But not completely. They'd gone to a studio, paid for a portrait, written names on the back. They'd left a trail that had somehow survived a century. He slid into the car and pulled out his notebook, jotting down, to do, 1920 census, Greenwood, search for Samuel and Clara Johnson. Look for Thomas, white child. Check local newspapers around March 1920. Follow up. Evelyn Price, Magnolia Gardens as he started the engine. A strange feeling settled over him, part dread, part excitement. He had come to Mississippi to track down dry land records. For a client? Instead, he had stumbled onto a crack in the official story of history. A photograph that should not exist. By the time he reached his hotel and opened his laptop. The mystery had its hooks in him. That night, James began with the 1920 census for Greenwood, Mississippi. It didn't take long. There they were. Samuel Johnson, 32, black. Carpenter, Homer Claire Johnson, 29, black. Seamstress Ruth Johnson, 10, daughter Dorothy Johnson, 8, daughter. He stared at the screen. 2 daughters. No son. No Thomas. He tried birth records next, searching Leffler County for any white boy named Thomas born between 1912 and 1914. A handful appeared in the files, but each one, when cross-referenced, was accounted for in their own families. None of them disappeared into a black family's portrait. James frowned, thinking, if Thomas wasn't born to Samuel and Clara, then he had to come from somewhere else, or someone else. He fired off an email to his research assistant back in Chicago. Subject: urgent. Leffler County records need death records, 1918 to 1920. Search for white couples dying within months of each other, especially with young children. Also, orphanage records, county homes, children's institutions. Something's off here. Then he turned to the digitized newspaper archives. Page after page of the Greenwood Commonwealth flickered by, crop prices, society notes, lynching threats, couched in polite language, small tragedies, and local gossip. Then, On February 3rd, 1920, a headline caught his eye. Tragic accident claims local COE. She zoomed in and read, Mr. Robert Hayes, 34, and his wife Margaret, 29, perished in a house fire on February 1st. The couple leaves behind one son, age 6. A cold prickle slid down his back. One son, age 6, thought the right age for Thomas. He searched for more about the Hayes family follow-up stories, funeral notices, any mention of the child. There was almost nothing. The boy vanished from the printed record as if swallowed by the flames. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the dark window of his hotel room. His laptop screen reflected there like a doorway. A white couple dies in a fire. A 6-year-old son disappears. 6 weeks later, a black family poses for a formal portrait with a white boy named Thomas. His email notification dinged. A reply from his assistant. Children's Home investigated in 1921. Greenwood County Children's Home. Overcrowded. Abusive. Children used as unpaid labor. Several children adopted, but records incomplete or unverifiable. Director not charged. Facility shut down 1923. Records full of gaps. Multiple children unaccounted for. James pulled a fresh sheet from his notebook and drew a timeline. February 1st, 1920. Robert and Margaret Hayes die in house fire. February 3rd, 1920. Newspaper reports orphan son, age 6. March 14th, 1920. Johnson family portrait with white boy labeled Thomas, 6 weeks. Just 6 weeks between the fire and the photograph. He picked up the picture again, studying Samuel's protective hand on Thomas's small shoulder, Clara's calm, unwavering gaze, the two girls flanking their new brother. What did you risk? He whispered. He found a property record, 412 Elm Street, purchased by Samuel Johnson in 1980. A modest house by the description. A place where 4 faces in a photograph had once lived, and where a 5th had been hidden. Loved, and somehow erased from official memory. Midnight crept past. Unnoticed, James closed his notebook and looked at the photograph one last time before setting it on the nightstand. To those 5 faces, he said quietly, almost like a vow, I'll find the truth. I'll find Thomas's family. I'll tell your story. Tomorrow he would visit Magnolia Gardens to speak with Evelyn Price. Tonight he had enough to know one thing. This was no longer just an odd photograph, it was an untold story waiting to be uncovered. A secret carried in silence for 100 years. And James Mitchell was not going to let it stay buried. Morning sunlight filtered through moss-draped oak branches as James pulled into the quiet parking lot of Magnolia Gardens Care Home. The building sat low and peaceful beneath the massive trees, its red brick walls softened by decades of southern humidity. James clutched a folder containing the 1920 photograph as he stepped inside, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. Today, he hoped he would finally find a living link to the Johnson family, someone who remembered. Someone who knew the truth behind the boy called Thomas. A nurse escorted him to the sunroom, where an elderly woman sat in a worn pastel armchair by the window. Evelyn Price, 93 years old, small and delicate like a bird, waited with sharp, alert eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Her thin hands rested lightly on a crocheted blanket over her lap. When James approached, she nodded once, as if she had been expecting him all along. You're the genealogist, she said, in a soft voice that carried surprising strength. Come sit. My knees don't work, but my mind still does. James introduced himself and gently placed the photograph in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but from age, not emotion, as she lifted it closer to her face. For a long time she stared at the image, her expression shifting from concentration to recognition, then to something deeper and heavier. Samuel and Clara Johnson, she murmured finally. Yes, I remember them. I was 5 or 6, but I remember. My mother knew Clara from Mount Zion Baptist Church. James leaned forward, holding his breath. Do you remember anything about this photograph being taken? He asked. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the side as if watching scenes from long ago come alive again. There was talk, she whispered. A lot of talk. People were scared. Having that boy in the picture was dangerous. But Samuel insisted on it. He wanted proof evidence that the child had existed, that he had been loved, that someone had cared if something happened to him. Her voice trembled with a memory that seemed to weigh heavily even now. How did he end up with them? James asked. Evelyn inhaled slowly. You must understand something, Mr. Mitchell. In 1920 Mississippi, a black person could be killed for looking at a white person wrong. Touching a white child. She shook her head, the lines in her face tightening. That was asking for a rope in a tree. But Samuel and Clara, they did it anyway. She paused, gathering the pieces of a story she carried her whole life. The boy's parents died in that fire, the Hayes family. Poor white folks, when they died, nobody wanted the boy. No kin. No protection. And the county home, the Greenwood Children's Home. Her voice cracked with disgust. Everyone knew what that place was. Children went in and didn't come out the same. If they came out at all. James nodded, remembering the grim reports he'd read the night before. Samuel was working near where the Hayes lived, Evelyn continued. The day after the fire, he saw the boy sitting on the burned steps, alone. No one else around. The county people were coming to take him to that terrible place. So he went home and told Clara, and Evelyn closed her eyes. My mother said Clara cried. They had 2 daughters. They knew how dangerous it would be. But Clara said she couldn't let a child go there no matter what color he was. She said God would judge them if they turned away. James felt a lump in his throat. So they took him? In the middle of the night, Evelyn said, nodding. Before the county men came, they just took him home. A faint smile touched her lips. They told the white folks he was Clara's nephew from up north. Mixed race, they said, passing for white. Maybe believable if you didn't look close. And most people didn't want to walk close. The black community knew, though. We all did. And we protected them. For 2 whole years, we kept the secret. James stared at the photograph in awe. What was he like? Thomas? A sweet boy, Evelyn said. Quiet at first, scared, but he played with Ruth and Dorothy like a brother. Samuel taught him little things: carpentry, measuring wood, using tools. Clara sang to him at night, my mother said. He called them Mama and Papa. Silence fell between them for a moment. Then James asked the question he dreaded. What happened to him? Evelyn's expression fell, her eyes clouding with sorrow. By 1922, it had become too dangerous. The boy looked even more white as he grew, and the clan, they were bold that year. Threats were everywhere. Clara had a cousin in Chicago, Dan Porter, married to a white man, a union organizer. They sent Thomas north in June 1922. Clara wept for days after. My mother said she never got over it. Did they stay in contact? James asked softly. Secret letters, Evelyn said. For years. Thomas wrote back when he was older, said he remembered them, loved them. Then, after Samuel died in 1935, the letters stopped. Ruth burned them after Clara passed in 47, thought it was safer. Evelyn placed the photograph gently back in James' hands. It's time the story was told. Mr. Mitchell, Samuel and Clara risked everything to save a child who didn't look like them, in a time when that meant death. Find Thomas's family. Tell them what happened. Make sure people know that even in the darkest times, some chose love over fear. James swallowed hard, overwhelmed. I promise, he whispered. Evelyn nodded once, satisfied, and looked again at the photograph, this time not with memory, but with farewell. And in that sunlit room with a 93-year-old witness to history sitting before him, James understood that the mystery was no longer a puzzle to solve. It was a legacy to honor. No, Zion Baptist Church stood on the corner of Elm and 3rd. Like a survivor, its modest red brick walls weathered by time, its white steeple pointing stubbornly toward the sky. James arrived on a warm Tuesday afternoon, the photograph carefully tucked in his bag. The stories Evelyn Price had told him echoed in his mind as he stepped out of his car. If anyone still held the missing pieces of the past, he hoped they lay within these walls. Inside, the church smelled faintly of old hymnals, wood polish, and the lingering warmth of last Sunday's service. The sanctuary was empty except for a woman sitting at a desk in the front office. She looked up as James approached. "Afternoon," she greeted warmly. "I'm Patricia Lewis, church secretary. How can I help you?" "I'm researching the Johnson family from the 1920s, James said carefully. Samuel and Clara Johnson. Patricia's eyes widened the moment he spoke the names, as though he had uttered something sacred. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood. "I think you should meet Pastor Williams," she said. "Wait here." Moments later, a tall man in his 50s entered the room. He had a calm presence, dressed in a dark shirt with rolled sleeves and glasses hanging low on his nose. Pastor Marcus Williams extended a hand. "Patricia says you're asking about the Johnsons." James nodded and pulled out the photograph. "I found this in the county archive." The pastor took the image, and as soon as his eyes drifted to the pale-faced boy in the center, his expression sharpened. He glanced at Patricia, who gave a small, knowing nod. "Come with me." The pastor said quietly. He led James down a narrow staircase to the church basement, where shelves lined the walls, stacked with record books, meeting notes, and worn leather-bound ledgers. Amid the dust and dim bulbs, the past seemed almost alive. The pastor pulled out a thick ledger marked 1918 to 1925. Reverend Walter Thompson served here in the 1920s. Williams explained. He kept meticulous records. Not just public entries, private pastoral notes, too. Sensitive matters the congregation trusted him with. He laid the ledger on a table and opened it carefully. The old paper crackled under his fingers. Let's see. March 1920. He flipped a few pages, then stopped. There. James leaned closer. Samuel and Claire Johnson, with daughters Ruth and Dorothy and Ward Thomas, age 6. Family portrait commissioned? May God protect them in their righteous undertaking. A shiver ran down James's spine. "Oh, Ward," he said. So Reverend Thompson knew. "Oh, he knew," Pastor Williams said. The whole church did. He turned more pages, revealing entry after entry. April 19, pray for the Johnson family's protection. September 1920, collection for Johnson. Household needs. December 1921, pray for wisdom regarding the child's future. James stared at the ink-faded but resolute. The congregation had actively supported the family, guarded their secret, prayed over them. It wasn't just a family taking a risk. It was an entire community acting as a shield. Patricia returned carrying a small box. "The Reverend's personal journals," she said, placing it gently on the table. "Be careful with these." James opened the top journal. The handwriting was neat, old-fashioned, and full of emotion. March 15th, 1920. Samuel Johnson came to me troubled. He has taken in the Hayes child, knowing the danger. I asked why he would risk everything. He said, "Reverend, I looked in that boy's eyes and saw my own daughters. Could not send him to die slowly in that place. I gave him my blessing and my silence." James felt a swell of emotion in his chest as the next entries unfolded. June 1921. The boy Thomas thrives with the Johnsons. He calls them Mama and Papa. He knows not the color of his skin matters to the world, only that he is loved. This is what Christianity truly means. May 1922. Clara weeps. They must send Thomas north. The clan marched openly. I pray God protects this child and remembers this family sacrifice. James's hands shook as he photographed every page with the pastor's permission. This wasn't just corroboration. It was powerful, irrefutable proof of an extraordinary act of courage. "There's one more thing," Pastor Williams said. He opened the wooden box Patricia had brought. Inside was a single fragile envelope, yellowed with age. This came with the Reverend's effects when he passed. He never showed it to anyone, but kept it safe. He handed it to James. The envelope was addressed to Reverend Thompson, July 1922, Chicago inside, in childish handwriting. "Dear Reverend Thompson, Mama Diane says I should write to say I arrived safe. I miss Mama Clara and Papa Samuel and Ruth and Dorothy very much. Mama Diane is kind, and Uncle James too. They say I can go to school here. I will never forget my family in Greenwood. Please tell them I love them. Thomas James felt his eyes burn. Across the table, Castor Williams wiped his own. This stays in our archive, the pastor said gently. But you are welcome to tell the story. The world needs to know what Samuel and Clara Johnson did. Our community has carried this truth quietly for generations. Maybe it's time. James closed the envelope with trembling hands. Thank you, he whispered. Walking out of the church into the afternoon light, he felt overwhelmed. Not by the mystery, no. That was becoming clear, but by the profound humanity of it all. An entire congregation had held their breath for 2 years, praying for the safety of a child who wasn't theirs. Decades later, they still guarded the memory of that courage. Now the story was in James's hands. And for the first time, he truly understood the weight of what he had found. The past was no longer just ink on paper. It had a heartbeat. Back in Chicago, the city greeted James with sharp winds, honking traffic, and the familiar rush of a place that never paused. Yet inside his apartment, surrounded by open laptops and stacks of notes, James felt a deeper urgency than ever before. The church records, Evelyn's testimony, and the photograph all pointed to one truth. Thomas Hayes had survived because of the Johnsons. Now it was time to follow the child's trail north, the secret life he lived after leaving Mississippi. James began with the most logical source, the 1920 and 1930 Chicago census records. The church journal had mentioned Claire's cousin, Diane Porter, who lived on the south side. It didn't take long to find her. The 1920 census listed Diane Porter, 26, black, married to James Porter, 29, white union organizer. Address, 47,732 South Indiana Avenue. James leaned closer. A black woman married to a white union man in 1920 Chicago wasn't common. But the city, especially the South Side, was a complex, shifting world of migration, races, and working class. Solidarity. It seemed a perfect place for a child like Thomas to disappear safely. Then he checked the 1930 census, hoping for a miracle, and found one. At that same address, now 10 years later, listed with 2 Porter children, appeared Thomas Hayes, age 16, nephew. James felt a thrill shoot through him. There he is, hidden in plain sight, not listed as adopted, not listed as white. Simply a nephew in easy category, a safe one, a place for a boy with 2 identities to land. From there, James traced the boy into adulthood. Slowly, the pieces began to form a quiet life shaped not by secrets alone, but by survival. A 1935 marriage license in Cook County confirmed the next step. Thomas Hayes married Anna Schmidt, age 19. Occupation, carpenter. A carpenter, just like Samuel Johnson. James paused, letting that connection settle. It wasn't just a trade, it was an inheritance of love from the man who taught a frightened 6-year-old how to hold a tool, how to measure wood, how to build something steady when the world around him was not. James kept searching. He found a modest trail through city directories and tax records, no arrests, no major scandals, no newspaper mention. Thomas Hayes lived quietly, likely trying not to attract attention in a world that might ask too many questions about a past he couldn't fully explain. Finally, James found the end of the trail. Thomas Hayes died 1987, Evanston, Illinois, age 73. He sat back, staring at the record. The boy in the photograph had lived a full adult life, married, worked, raised a family, all while carrying the buried truth of where he'd come from. But he hadn't died alone in history. Thomas and Anna had 3 children. Robert Hayes, born 1937, Margaret Hayes, born 1939, Elizabeth Hayes, born 1942, adults now in their 80s, if still alive. And each of them, James realized, would know nothing about the Johnsons. Nothing about Samuel's protective hand. Nothing about Clara's songs at night. Nothing about the danger that once surrounded their father. 3 branches of a family tree built on courage, yet cut from the Truth. It was time to reconnect them. James began with Robert Hayes, the eldest son. Property records led him to a house in Oak Park, sold in 2015. A quick obituary search revealed the rest. Robert Hayes died at age 78, survived by his wife, Susan, and 3 children, Michael, Jennifer, and Thomas Hayes, Jr. A. Second Thomas, named after the boy who survived Mississippi. Scrolling through social media, James found Thomas Hayes, Jr., a man in his late 40s, a Chicago resident, and astonishingly a high school history teacher. His public posts were filled with photos of civil rights trips, lesson plans about social justice, and reflections on American history. James stared at the screen, struck silent. This teacher, had no idea that his very existence was tied to one of the most extraordinary stories of racial courage in American history. A boy saved by a black family in Jim Crow, Mississippi, had grown into a man who taught history and fought for justice, unaware that his own bloodline was shaped by that very struggle. James opened a new message window, paused, then typed with, "Care, Mr. Hayes, my name is James Mitchell. I am a genealogist, and I have discovered something remarkable about your grandfather, Thomas Hayes, something that I believe you and your family do not know. It is a story involving extraordinary courage during a dangerous time in American history. If you're willing, I'd like to share everything with you. I can provide full documentation and proof." He hovered for a moment, knowing this message could change a man's life. Then he pressed send. The next 2 days passed slowly, every notification making his pulse spike. When the reply finally arrived, James felt his chest tighten. "Mr. Mitchell, I am intrigued. My grandfather rarely spoke about his childhood. We were told he lost his parents young and was raised by relatives in Chicago. I would very much like to hear what you found. Can we meet?" They arranged to meet at a downtown cafe the following afternoon. When James arrived, he spotted Thomas Hayes, Jr. instantly, a tall man with graying edges in his hair, warm eyes behind, square glasses, and a worn messenger bag slung over his shoulder. A scholar, a teacher, someone who believed in truth. They shook hands, and for a moment they simply regarded each other, one carrying answers, the other seeking a history he never knew was missing. James knew what came next would change everything. He reached into his bag and pulled out the 1920 photograph. He slid it across the table. "This," he said softly, "is your grandfather." The world shifted, and the story of 2 families separated by a century of silence was about to begin again. The cafe felt impossibly small for the weight of what James had just revealed. The 1920 photograph lay between them on the table, its sepia tone soft in the afternoon light. Thomas Hayes, Jr. stared at it with wet eyes and trembling hands. His face had gone pale when James explained, piece by piece, how his grandfather had been saved by a black family in Mississippi, protected, hidden, loved, and then sent north for his safety. Now Thomas blinked rapidly, trying to anchor himself. "My grandfather was raised by a black family," he whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. "In Mississippi? In 1920? "Yes," James said gently. "For nearly 2 years. And they've risked everything to keep him alive?" Thomas leaned back, staring at the boy in the picture, the boy who shared his name. He swallowed hard. "He never told us." "He never told anyone. Maybe he thought the truth would bring trouble," James suggested. "Or maybe the pain of losing 2 sets of parents, his birth family and the Johnsons, was too much to relive." People carry their silence differently. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he whispered, "They saved him." "They saved all of us." James nodded. "I believe that." Thomas took the photograph in both hands, holding it like something holy. When he finally spoke again, his voice had strengthened. "Mr. Mitchell." "James, I want to meet them." "The Johnson descendants." "I want to thank them. Our whole family needs to know this." James felt a rush of relief. "I was hoping you'd say that." Tracing Ruth Johnson's line back home, James dove back into public records. He began with Ruth Johnson, the older daughter in the photograph. In the 1930 census, She still lived with her parents. By 1940, she had disappeared from Greenwood records. Marriage records provided the missing link. Ruth Johnson married William Crawford in 1933. Crawford, the same name as the photographer who took the 1920 portrait. James dug deeper and discovered the connection. William Crawford was the son of Albert Crawford, the photographer who had risked his own safety to take that picture. The connection ran deeper than he had expected. The man who documented the Johnsons' courage raised a son who married into their family. Ruth and William had 4 children. Their daughter, Clara Crawford, named after Ruth's mother, moved to Memphis, married Jerome Washington, and raised 3 children. One of them was Ruth Washington. Born in 1962, James found her on social media. A retired teacher, deeply involved in church and community history. He sent her a message similar to the one he sent Thomas. Her response arrived within hours. My grandmother, Ruth, always hinted that our family had a great secret, something dangerous, something brave. She said she'd tell me when I was older, but she passed before she could. Is this about that? They arranged a video call. When the photograph appeared on her screen, Ruth Washington's hand flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks as James explained, step by step, what had happened. They saved a white child, she whispered. In Mississippi? In Jim Crow, Mississippi? She shook her head as if overwhelmed. My grandmother knew him. She was 10 years old. She would have remembered everything. James told her about Thomas Hayes, Jr. He wants to meet you, he said softly. He wants to thank your family. Ruth. Washington closed her eyes, breath trembling. 100 years later, they're finally coming together again. Yes, of course. It's what my grandmother always wanted. Tracing Dorothy Johnson's line next, James turned to Dorothy, the younger daughter. She married Marcus Lewis in 1935 and moved to Chicago during the Great Migration. Their children had grown up in the same city where Thomas Hayes lived as an adult. One of those children, Patricia. Lewis was still in Chicago. James froze when he put the pieces together. Patricia Lewis, the church secretary who had helped him at Mount Zion Baptist Church. He called Pastor Williams immediately. You? James said. Pastor Williams's voice was calm. Yes, he admitted. I'm Dorothy Johnson's grandson. Patricia is her daughter. James sat in stunned silence. Why didn't you tell me? He finally asked. Because the story needed to be discovered, not handed to you, Pastor. Williams said, if we just told you, it might have sounded like family folklore. But you found the photograph. You found Evelyn. You found the records. You proved it independently. James understood. This was a story built on trust, on dignity, on the weight of a century of silence. It needed to be uncovered with care, and Thomas Hayes Jr. wants to meet all of you. James said, we will meet him. The pastor replied, it's time. The families come together 3 months later on a warm June Saturday. The sanctuary of Mount Zion Baptist Church was full, not for a funeral, not for a Sunday service, but for a reunion that history itself seemed to demand. Descendants of Samuel and Clara Johnson, nearly 30 of them, filled the pews. Ruth Washington had traveled from Memphis with her children and grandchildren. Pastor Williams's extended family was there too, along with many cousins whose ancestors had been part of the Quiet Protection in 1920. From Chicago came 23 members of the Hayes family, children, grandchildren, cousins, and siblings, all carrying the blood of the boy the Johnsons saved. The photograph from 1920 was projected on a large screen at the front of the church. James stood with Pastor Williams, his heart hammering as Thomas Hayes Jr. stepped to the podium. Thomas looked out at the rows of black families before him, families whose courage had saved his own. He swallowed hard, his voice shaky but determined. I am standing here today because of your ancestors, he began. My grandfather lost his parents in a fire when he was 6. He should have been sent to a cruel orphanage. Instead, Samuel and Clara Johnson, who lived under the threat of violence every single day, risked their lives to save him. He paused, voice thick with emotion. He grew up, he married, he raised my father. He helped raise me. Thomas scanned the room, his eyes wet. I exist because of Samuel and Claire Johnson. My children exist because of them. We are here because of their courage. He stepped off the podium, walked straight to Ruth Washington, and took her hands. Thank you, he whispered, for what your great-grandparents did, for keeping this story alive. Ruth wept openly as she embraced him. Around them, the sanctuary was filled with tears of grief, gratitude, healing. For the first time in 100 years, two families separated by race, history, fear, and silence stood together, bound by an act of love that had outlived. It's dangerous. James watched from the aisle, overwhelmed. This wasn't genealogy anymore. It was a resurrection, a story pulled from the ashes. A legacy restored? The past, once buried under fear, was finally lifting its head into the light. The sanctuary emptied slowly, as if no one wanted the moment to end. Generations of Hayes and Johnson descendants lingered in small circles, laughing, crying, holding hands, studying the old photograph projected above them like a guardian watching over its family. For James, standing off to the side, it felt like witnessing history untangle itself, then braid back together into something stronger. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast warm light across Mount Zion Baptist Church. A few local reporters, tipped off after word spread, waited quietly near the steps. Pastor Williams and Thomas Hayes Jr. stepped forward together. James watched as the men addressed the cameras, not with spectacle, but with sincerity. Thomas spoke first, holding up a large printed copy of the 1920 photograph. In 1920, he said, "My grandfather, Thomas Hayes, lost his parents in a fire. He was 6 years old, alone, and about to be sent to an abusive orphanage. A black family, the Johnsons, took him in, hid him, protected him, and loved him at tremendous risk to themselves." He paused, steadying his voice. "Today, our families reunited to honor that act of courage." Reporters leaned in. Cameras clicked. For the first time in a century, the story was stepping out of the shadows. Pastor Williams then spoke firmly, addressing the inevitable question rising online. Why highlight a black family saving a white child when so many black children suffered in that same system? This story, he said, does not erase the suffering of our people. Samuel and Clara lived under oppression their entire lives. They face racism every day. That is exactly why their choice matters. Despite the danger, despite the injustice, they chose love. They chose to save a child who would grow up with privileges they themselves never had. That is not an erasure of our history. It is a testament to their humanity. The words resonated. Within hours, the story spread across the country. Nation Responds major newspapers ran front-page features. Television segments replayed the 1920 photograph beside images of the reunited families. Social media erupted with millions of shares. Teachers, activists, historians, and ordinary people moved by a story that challenged the darkest assumptions of Jim Crow America. Comments flooded in. This proves courage exists even in the worst times. This should be in every history textbook. I'm crying at work. What heroes? Why have we never heard this story before? For once, the internet wasn't arguing. It was celebrating. The photograph, scanned and shared thousands of times, became an icon, evidence that even in a brutal system built on hatred, there were people who defied it quietly, fiercely, at great personal cost. The National Museum of African American History and Culture reached out first. They requested the original photograph, offering to display it alongside a full exhibit telling the Johnson story. The families agreed unanimously. The photograph would finally stand where it belonged, not forgotten in a dusty archive, but honored in history. A legacy that lives on. The Hayes and Johnson families worked together to establish the Samuel and Claire Johnson Foundation, dedicated to improving the foster care system, funding scholarships for vulnerable children, and supporting ethical adoption practices. Donations poured in faster than anyone had expected. The story had touched people deeply, and thousands wanted to help continue the ripple of compassion Samuel and Clara had started. Mount Zion Baptist Church became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors came to stand where the Johnsons once worshipped, to see the ledger entries Reverend Thompson had written, to feel the presence of courage preserved in ink and memory. Meanwhile, the abandoned Johnson home at 412 Elm Street weathered, and empty for decades, was purchased by the foundation, restored brick by brick, and reopened as the Johnson Hayes Museum of Compassion and Resilience. Inside, visitors walked through rooms filled with photographs, artifacts, recordings of Evelyn Price's testimony, and displays explaining the dangerous world the Johnsons faced. In one glass case, under soft lights, sat a small wooden toy, a hand-carved horse with S.J. etched beneath it. The toy Thomas Hayes had kept for 73 years. People cried when they saw it. James Mitchell's work. James wrote a book. A light in the dark. The Johnsons of Greenwood, detailing every step of the discovery. It became a bestseller, used in schools, universities, and community groups. But the greatest reward for James wasn't fame or money. It was seeing the two families, once separated by silence, walking into a new future together. In interviews, James often said Samuel and Clara weren't activists or leaders. They were working people trying to survive. But when the choice came, nor a suffering child or risk everything, they chose love. That's the quiet kind of heroism that changes the world. He meant every word. Love across time 5 years after the reunion. History repeated itself in a beautiful, unexpected way. At Mount Zion Baptist Church, exactly where the story had first come alive again. Thomas Hayes Jr.'s daughter, Sarah Hayes, married Marcus Williams III, the great-great-grandson of Samuel and Clara Johnson, two families who should never have crossed paths in 1920, were now becoming one family in 2025. During the ceremony, Sarah and Marcus placed flowers before a framed portrait of Samuel and Clara. The same photograph that had started everything sat on a table nearby, its sepia faces watching as their descendants pledged their lives to one another. Marcus's vows brought tears to every eye in the sanctuary. Love brought our families together twice, he said. First through a brave decision in 1920, and now through us. We carry their legacy forward, the legacy of courage, compassion, and the belief that love can cross any barrier. After the ceremony, the families gathered for a group picture. On the church lawn, someone held a original 1920 photograph beside them. A century stood between the two images, but the bond was unbroken. Later that night, Sarah and Marcus visited Samuel and Clara's graves. The stones, once forgotten, now stood bright and tended, surrounded by flowers planted by their descendants. "We're naming our first child after them," Sarah whispered. "Samuel, if it's a boy. Clara, if it's a girl." Marcus took her hand. "They won't ever be forgotten again." A legacy of light above the quiet cemetery. The Mississippi sky stretched wide and full of stars, the same stars that had watched Samuel and Clara make their impossible decision in 1920. A photograph taken a century earlier had held a mystery. No one could explain. Now the mystery was solved, and its truth had changed lives. A story of humanity rising above hatred. A story of a family who risked everything. A story of a boy who lived because love refused to bow to fear. Samuel and Clara Johnson were gone, but their legacy lived on in the descendants who carried their blood, in the family they saved, and in everyone who heard their story and chose compassion over cruelty, courage over fear, love over division. The photograph remained in the Smithsonian for all to see, but the real legacy lived inside the hearts of those who understood. Even in the darkest times, a single act of love can light the world